Welcome to part 2 of this presentation on Aion, the phenomenology of self. This is a deep dive into the work of Carl Jung and this exploration of the difference between the ego, or the persona, the experienced subjective ego, and the true self, and the struggle, what the difference even is between those two things, and what is the actual phenomenology of self, what is the felt experience, but also the nature of it. Welcome part 2. Part 1 ended with the anima animus thing that was a little bit one of Jung's a little bit more challenging ideas, but we're just going to keep going on this, and I think you'll find this presentation pretty interesting, I hope. So grab a coffee, hope you're having a good day, and let's get into it. So in this slide, sorry, that last one cut off right at the end, but that sometimes happens with the PowerPoint. You really have to finish your point and then hit stop recording slide. If you like kind of try to be really cute and like finish your sentence and like be hitting the thing as you're finishing, it cuts off the last couple words. Anyways, didn't need to say that. The link to the concept of archetypes. So we're about to get into this idea of when we say there's different types of people, right? That what does that even mean? That there could be like, not everybody lives and behaves and acts and experiences things in the same way, and you could almost say there's like different types of ways people do that, and there's like certain types that are so core to human experience. They're like part of the arche, or this Greco word of like Greco-Roman word of like arche meant like the underlying essence of the universe, architecture, archaeology, similar root. So an archetype is like the hero, the anti-hero, the trickster, the good king, the evil king, the loving mother, the overbearing mother. These are stories that are so old that, because Jung was fascinated by things like cave paintings and why there's these similarities in all these cave paintings from these early humans from around the world, and I'm going to get more into that in the presentation on human origins. Why was there these similarities? And he was thinking because they were experiencing psychological experiences that were similar, and they were trying to represent those, and there was some commonality. And this is a tough idea. And so he goes, this is of course no more than a hypothesis, but we're driven by the peculiar nature of the empirical material, not to mention the high probability that the general similarity of psychic processes in all individuals must be based on the equally general and impersonable principle that conforms to law, just as the instinct manifesting itself in the individual is only a partial manifestation of an instinctual substrate common to all men, women, whatever. The language of this day is talking about mankind, so it sounds very sexist in this way, but and in a way, you know, it does show it's a bit of that time. They talked like that, but Jung's obviously talking about females too. Like that doesn't even need to be said, or maybe it does. But this is no more than a hypothesis, but it seems like it. And Jung does a lot of these kind of qualifier comments, right? Where he's like, I was talking about this the other day with someone about what Jung was saying about dreams, right? One of the most, and I said it in the presentation I made for the students that have had me before, he's like one of the biggest experts of all time on dreams, besides Freud's interpretation of dreams. He has probably the second best-selling book on dreams ever, like the Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. Great one for you to add to your personal library. But even he says, like, when someone tells me their dream to interpret, I start off by telling myself, I have no idea what this dream means. And then I'll try to interpret it, and that there's like a real benefit to that humility, right? It's like, just because I'm talking about the episode of the unconscious doesn't mean I'm like some super expert that can explain everything. And this is what Jung's even saying, is like, but there seems to be something going on. It's like we're not just stimulus response, mechanistic animals. Just as the constellations were projected into the heavens, similar figures were projected into legend and fairy tales, or upon historical persons. So Jung's saying, like, these archetypes is why we see these common themes in fairy tales and in legends and in mythology and in the teachings of all these different seemingly separated groups of humans. It's because it's the same mind telling the stories. And this mind has these archetypal templates that it uses.
Few people have had as much influence on modern psychology as Carl Jung. He has coined terms such as extroversion and introversion, archetypes, anima and animus, shadow, and the collective unconscious, among others. He was a practicing psychiatrist and is regarded as the founder of analytical psychology, or Jungian analysis. In his early years, he came into contact with Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. They had a close relation and collaborated on a joint vision of human psychology. However, they parted ways as Jung's personal research on analytical psychology, and especially upon the discovery of a collective unconscious, made it impossible for him to follow Freud's psychoanalysis. This resulted in a painful schism after years of collaboration. Jung's analytical psychology essentially gave birth to the empirical science of the psyche, which culminated in his magnum opus, The Collected Works, written over a period of 60 years during his lifetime. Jung distinguishes our psyche into three different realms: consciousness, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. Consciousness is composed of our field of awareness, all the experiences that we are aware of. This is where we form our ego. However, according to Jung, it is dwarfed in relation to the unconscious. The personal unconscious is particular to each individual and is made of parts that are unique to our own lives. Thoughts we are not aware of, have forgotten, or have been repressed due to their disturbing nature. On the other hand, the collective unconscious is the deepest part of our unconscious, which is genetically inherited and not shaped by personal experience. This is where the archetypes are found. Archetypes represent universal patterns and images that are part of the collective unconscious. Jung believed that we inherit these archetypes just as we inherit instinctive patterns of behavior. Jung was also an expert on the study of religious and mythological symbology. The work in both of these fields led to the discovery of the archetypes. The study of these myths of cultures revealed similar patterns. He even found the same symbols in dreams of patients suffering from schizophrenia, which reinforced the idea of archetypes and the collective unconscious. Apart from his travels in the United States and England, Jung had traveled to East Africa to learn about the natives who had never been in contact with European culture. He had also traveled to India, where he felt himself under the influence of a foreign culture for the first time. Hinduism played an important element in his understanding of the role of symbolism and the unconscious. Although Jung suggested a series of archetypes such as the father, the mother, the wise old man, the hero, the trickster, among others, we will be focusing on what are regarded as the four major Jungian archetypes: the self, the persona, the shadow, and the anima animus. The first archetype is the self. To understand the self, we need to know how it differs from the ego, which is part of the realm of consciousness. Jung considers the self to be superior in rank to the ego. The ego is acquired during an individual's lifetime, and therefore it is a conscious factor. In theory, you could describe the ego completely, but this would only amount to the conscious personality, not the total picture, which would have to include the unconscious parts. The ego is composed of the somatic and the psychic factors. The somatic is the physical self, our body, while the psychic relates to our inner self, our mind. Both the somatic and the psychic have conscious and unconscious factors. The ego's main characteristic is our individuality. That is part of our consciousness. However, it is only one part of the personality and not the whole of it. The remaining part is composed of the unconscious. The sum of the conscious and unconscious is what Jung calls the self, which makes up the total personality of an individual. To achieve the self, Jung's central concept revolved around what he called individuation, or self-realization, a lifelong process of distinguishing the self out of each individual's conscious and unconscious elements. This he believed to be the main goal of human psychological development. Now we delve into what Jung considered the most important part of ourselves, the unconscious. Here's where we encounter the persona, shadow, anima, and animus, which have the most disturbing influence on the ego. The persona. The persona is known as a conformity archetype. It is an element of the personality which arises for reasons of adaptation or personal convenience. If you have certain masks you put on in various situations, that is a persona. In essence, it conceals our real self, presenting ourselves as someone different to who we really are. As we please other people with our persona, it leaves our negative traits that contradict our real selves, forming our shadow. The shadow. Jung stated the shadow to be the unknown dark side of the personality. Whereas the contents of the personal unconscious are acquired during an individual's lifetime, the contents of the collective unconscious are invariably archetypes that were present from the beginning. Among the shadow, the anima, and the animus, the most accessible and easiest to experience is the shadow, since it can be retrieved from the contents of the personal unconscious. To be conscious of the shadow, there must be a considerable moral effort recognizing the dark aspects of one's personality as real and present. While some traits of one's own shadow can be recognized, some offer greater resistance to moral control and prove almost impossible to influence. An individual who does not recognize psychological projection, a defense mechanism in which the individual defends himself against the unconscious impulses, denying their existence in himself while attributing them to others, will eventually create an illusory environment whereby he changes the world into the replica of his own unknown face. The shadow plays an important role in balancing the overall psyche. A weak adaptation of the shadow results in a low level of personality, whereby the individual behaves like a passive victim of his shadow, extremely worried with the opinions of others, a walking persona. People who do not look at their shadows directly project them onto others. The qualities that we often cannot stand in others, we have in ourselves and wish not to see. But to truly grow as a person, one must integrate their shadow and balance it with their persona. It is possible for man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is rare for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. An encounter with your shadow may appear in dreams, typically as a person of the same sex as you. It depends on the living experience of each individual, rather than being inherited in the collective unconscious. The dissolution of the persona and understanding one's own shadow is a central part of the process of individuation. In terms of the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it must be Jekyll, the conscious personality, who integrates the shadow and not the other way around. Otherwise, you will become the slave of your autonomous shadow. The integration of the shadow marks the first stage of the analytical process. Without it, a recognition of anima and animus is impossible. However, the acknowledgement of the shadow must be a continuous process throughout one's life. Anima and animus. Within the shadow, there exist two contrasexual figures, the anima and the animus. In every man's psyche, there is an unconscious feminine aspect called the anima, which is a personification of all feminine psychological tendencies, while in every woman's psyche, there is an unconscious masculine aspect called the animus. Unlike the shadow, which represents the personal unconscious, through which its content can be made conscious, the anima and animus are much further away from consciousness and are seldom realized. Man's anima is characterized by the feminine eros. It is passive like a child seeking the protecting and nourishing charmed circle of the mother, while woman's animus corresponds to the paternal logos, the principle of rationality. When man is integrating the anima, it becomes the eros, giving way to a more caring figure. When woman is integrating the animus, it becomes the logos, giving woman a capacity for assertiveness and deliberation. The anima appears in dreams, visions, and fantasies, taking on a personified form. She is a spontaneous product of the unconscious, and not a substitute figure for the mother, present in every man. There are thoughts, feelings, and effects alive in us which we would never have believed possible. This seems like utter fantasy to anyone who has not yet experienced it by themselves, for a normal person knows what he thinks. The recognition of the anima gives rise to a triad: the masculine subject, the feminine subject, and the transcendent anima. With a woman, it gives rise to the transcendent animus. The continuous integration of the contents of the collective unconscious, making them part of the self, through psychotherapy, introspection, and having the moral fortitude to change one's own beliefs, can have a considerable influence on ourselves and give us a much more solid foundation in our psyche, helping us to overcome our daily struggles and become much more aware of who we truly are, and that there are elements in our psyche beyond our control.
Another one of Jung's really fascinating ideas is that not only do you have this deep unconscious with these archetypal templates, you also have an ability to engage that unconscious. And part of it is through this advanced practice that he called active imagination. And he thought that it was basically dreaming while awake. And it was this kind of advanced form of meditative, analytic daydreaming almost. The object of active imagination is to give a voice to the sides of the personality, particularly the anima, the animus, the shadow, that are normally not heard, thereby establishing the line of communication between consciousness and the unconscious. Even when the end products, drawing, painting, writing, sculpting, dance, music, martial arts, sports, reading, having a good time with a friend, conversation, right, that these highly engaged, there's something going on between creator and creation, and that transforms consciousness. There's something going on between musician and instrument, and that creative process affects the person. And it's the same with writing, and it's the same with martial art training, and it's the same with a lot of these kind of highly engaging practices. Something goes on between the creator and the creation that contributes to a transformation of consciousness.
Transference is one of the most important and intriguing concepts in psychology. It refers to the unconscious redirection of feelings from a person in one's past to another in the present. Knowing about the word and its meaning is a key to trying to become a slightly more mature and less dangerous person to be around. At the heart of the theory of transference is the idea that our expectations of what other people are like is to an overwhelming extent dictated by what the people in our immediate vicinity were like in our childhoods, especially our parents. These formative figures determine a whole range of our behaviors. Our sense of, for example, how people might respond to our weaknesses, whether those in authority are benign or humiliating, whether setbacks can be met with panic or resilience, whether others can be depended upon, and so on. In other words, we don't enter adulthood like a blank slate, waiting until all the data is in before we judge a situation and draw our conclusions strictly on the evidence in front of us. Instead, we have powerful but hidden tendencies to prejudge, according to patterns laid down by our personal histories. Some of this prejudgment might be sensible, but a lot of it can be very troublesome. We may get more panicked than is warranted. We may be so suspicious we don't give others a fair hearing. We may be so sure we're about to be attacked, we strike out preemptively. We may be so nervous, we fail. The key thing about transference is that we can't generally tell it's happening. We assume we're entirely reacting to the present, when in fact our feelings are drawing energy from a source from long ago. That's why maturity deeply depends on getting to know one's tendencies to transference. To help us in the task, psychologists have devised a number of tests to tease out these transferences. One exercise involves asking someone to finish sentence stubs very quickly, without giving too much thought, thereby allowing the unconscious to reveal itself. For example, Another classic transference exercise is the Rorschach test, devised in the 1930s by the psychologist Hermann Rorschach. By being shown an ambiguous image and asked to say what it was, Rorschach believed that we would naturally reveal some of our latent guiding fears, hopes, prejudices and assumptions. The important point in any Rorschach test is that the image has no one true meaning. Different people merely see different things in it according to what their past predisposes them to imagine. To one individual with a rather kindly and forgiving conscience, this image could be seen as a sweet mask with eyes, floppy ears, a covering for the mouth, and wide flaps extending from the cheeks. Another, more traumatized by, say, a domineering father, might see it as a powerful figure viewed from below, with splayed feet, thick legs, heavy shoulders, and the head bent forward as if poised for attack. The goal of maturity in general, and psychotherapy in particular, is to help you to get on top of your transferences. That means seeing the ways in which our views of authority or sexuality or uncertainty have been distorted. The idea is ultimately to be released from the past's indiscriminate hold on the present and to reduce the scope of our personal histories to determine our futures. Once we overcome our transferences, we can be free to respond more reliably to the world as it is, rather than how it was. If you like our films, take a look at our shop, theschooloflife.com/shop. You'll find lots of thoughtful books, games, stationery, and more.
So with this presentation, I wanted to kind of approach it a certain way, right? Like I would also recommend that everybody, and I can provide a link to the students, like that you all read the essay Aion by Carl Jung, and it'll help it make sense. And I think what I want to kind of end with today is touching on a few other psychologists that aren't Carl Jung, but that have been heavily influenced by him and have kind of an additional point to say on this. I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about Alfred Adler, I'm going to talk about Frankl, and I'm going to talk about Carl Rogers, just really briefly. And I know you've already heard me talk about them if you've had other courses with me in different contexts, but I want to touch on them here just briefly and how they relate to this. So one of the reasons, this is from someone named Desilec. I think I'm saying Marie J. Desilec, it's like top right there, her PhD in 2014. And she created this concept model of logotherapy, and I think it's really quite nice because why I like these kind of psychological model graphics is because it's kind of interesting. If you just look at it, it really is an attempt to try to capture a lot of the theory in a single image. And this idea that logotherapy is really about that there's something therapeutic about feeling like you're living a life that's meaningful and that has purpose. Finding meaning in life. What I give my life to through my creativity, what I receive to life from my life through my experiences, and the stance I take towards my life with my attitude. And it's trying to make this practical. It's like, okay, well, like, how can you figure out how to do something that at the end of the day you didn't hate that you were doing it all day and that you actually like it, or you feel like it has some value? And maybe you have to work a job to primarily to pay the bills, and then we're talking more about having like a meaningful, engaging hobby. Or maybe you're lucky enough to have it as your main job. And it's like, but the idea is that you need to actively seek those things in your life that feel meaningful. But that it's also your attitudinal stance towards it. So it's this combination of attitude and how that affects and creativity. And again, creativity doesn't mean like, at a certain point, like for me trying to figure out all this tech and do these videos and stuff is creativity. It's like, I'm someone that would probably score, I don't know, it depends how you define it, right? Like I'd probably score decent in creativity in some ways and not in other ways. Like I might be a decently creative thinker in some regards, but I can't draw. Like I'm not a good artist or anything like that. And maybe you're a really good artist, so it's like, it's really interesting. It's like, it's about finding a way to express. Right, and so you see on the left there, these guideposts or these ways of opportunities and areas for discovering meaning in life, like through self-discovery or through understanding choice, and that there's some things in your life that you can't control, but there's a lot of things in your life that you do have choice over, and what choices you make are really important, and situationally and attitudinally. Using like our own unique idiosyncratics, another word, or like specifically personal attributes, our creativity, our personal relationships, picking up responsibility and finding meaning in that. And then he has this interesting idea, right? And this is kind of a comment to Maslow, is like Maslow's idea of self-actualization, and Frankel's idea is like, that's a great thing, but you can't actually try to self-actualize. You almost have to try to move beyond a focus on self. And so Frankel has the classic quote that like, through self-transcendence, you can find self-actualization, that like the self has to almost be understood and then properly positioned within the psyche. And then once that happens, actualization is more of the label for once you've got there. It's not an actual thing you can try to add more of. Yeah, so it's just an interesting kind of perspective, right? Like, you could write an interesting paper on the complementary and contradictory nature of Maslow's idea of self-realization and Frankel's idea of self-transcendence, but in reality they both had tremendous respect for each other, and Frankel wasn't really challenging it. He was just saying like, that makes sense, but actually the weird thing about life is focusing on being a really good person is actually not the goal. What you do is focus on the ways that you're not being a good person. And it's this idea, and you're going to be looking at it in one of the options in the Philosophies of Mind assignment, is the psychological or the philosophical notion of negation, right? It's like, you can't be an authentic person, but you can stop being inauthentic, and you can find ways where you're not being your true self. And it's like, the less you're not being your true self, the more you're kind of being yourself. It's like an interesting philosophical stance that you find who you really are by an acute developing awareness of what you're not. That's bordering on like Stoic philosophy, but that's actually the philosophical principle of negation, like Negation, negation. All right, next slide.
I take it that there are people who have, you spoke of dying for something, who have nothing to live for, die for, defense mechanisms or whatever.
In fact, Professor Smith, I must say that there is a growing incidence of a feeling of total and ultimate meaninglessness of life, the lacking worthwhileness of one's life, the abysmal feeling of that of an inner void and emptiness. And many people, above all among the academic youth, is caught in this crippling and tantalizing experience of that there is no meaning to human existence at all. This emptiness, this boredom, this inner void, I've termed the existential vacuum, the frustration, that is to say, of that will to meaning of which I have started to speak.
I'm very curious at this point. You have been a frequent visitor to our country. Do you notice any difference between students in Europe and those in the United States on precisely this point of the sense of life's emptiness and meaninglessness?
Certainly. For instance, once I've improvisingly conducted a statistical inquiry and research among my students at the Medical School of Vienna University, students for whom I'm lecturing in German, that is to say, West German, Austrian, Swiss students, and so forth. And up to a percentage of 40%.
Not 14.
40. Why?
Yeah.
They admitted that they knew from their own experience this dreadful, abysmal feeling of a total and ultimate meaninglessness in life. And then, and this might be still more interesting to you, then I conducted the same experiment among my American students for whom I am lecturing in English at the University of Vienna. And the percentage of those who confessed that they knew from their own experience this existential vacuum was not 40, but 81%.
Well, now, of course, this immediately cries out for an explanation of why.
Partially, this might be due, last but not least, to this entirely and thoroughly mechanistic approach, which is so prevalent and so predominant in your culture and in your way and manner of approaching students, of teaching. What I mean is that you youngsters are told and taught that in the final analysis man is nothing but the battleground of conflicting, of clashing claims of an ego and superego. Oh, in the final analysis, nothing but, I'm stressing, nothing but the outcome, the mere outcome of various conditioning processes, be it that we then have to deal with sociological conditions or with conditions of psychological or biological nature and origin. This might be one of the causes accountable for this present state of affairs.
From the way you speak about that, it sounds, I gather, that you're totally opposed to this view. Is man then not caused? Is there no conditioning going on?
As a clinician, you may be sure that I am fully aware of that man is also determined and conditioned. What I'm against, what I'm pleading against is solely pan-determinism, as I used to call it. That is to say, regarding man as fully conditioned and determined. And as in my other quality you ascribe to me, not as a professor in 2 disciplines, but as a survivor of 4 German concentration camps, I can tell you that surely man is subject to conditions. Man is not at all free from conditions. But man is always free to take a stand toward whatsoever conditions he might be confronted with. And in this taking a stand, and to this precisely, to this very extent, he is free. There is choice of which attitude to adopt whenever confronted with an unchangeable situation. And when you are teaching people and preaching that man is to be, human existence is solely to be explained in terms either of the machine model or the rat model, I'm quoting now Gordon W. Allport, then you should no longer be surprised and astonished when people finally really behave like automata. They've never been taught and told anything else. This reminds me of the story which I recently heard in Vienna of a man who wanted to train his parrot that this parrot might say daddy to him. And this parrot did not do anything like this. And in order to punish the parrot, he jailed it overnight in the hen house. And when he visited the hen house in the morning, he found all chickens killed by the parrot, and the last living chicken the parrot held in its claws and bet it and screamed, "Say daddy to me, say daddy to me." He just behaved as he had been taught and told by his owner.
If you were to try to break down logotherapy into sort of the 7 main principles, or like the kind of core tenets, it'd be number 1. Frankl's whole point was that the one thing no one can take away from you is that decision to choose one thing over another. And he had that realization while in this brutal, terrible concentration camp situation. And he was realizing some people were just making a choice to, no matter what, try to be good people, and that it was a choice. Realize your will to meaning. So one of his big points, and it's like the will to meaning is actually the name of one of his books, but like this idea of that's your truest motive, and that when you're focusing on, and what's that advice really saying? It's like you'll be happiest and most, not necessarily happiest, but the most content if you feel like what you're doing matters. And one thing, part of that is to start to get better at detecting the things that do matter, detecting those moments that, and this is where I would also add, like, your body has a way of notifying you when you're experiencing something significant. You pay attention, you look at it, you're fascinated. It's like that should be signals to you, right? It's like there's a therapeutic aspect being like fascinated and interested in something, and like watching a bunch of documentaries on it, and like it's like that's like almost the opposite of being in like a negative thought spiral, right? So it's this constructive aspect of, or not constructive, this intentional aspect of developing mental discipline, sort of. Don't work against yourself. And don't work against yourself. Like, how many of us, it's like we could probably go, everyone that ever watches this, we could probably talk individually about what that would mean for you. And for some people, it's like the metaphor that I think of immediately is from sports. It's like if you're in your own head too much, it's like you're kind of taking yourself out of the play and you're doing a bit of the defense for the other team. It's like, don't defend yourself, is like a saying, right? Don't work against yourself. It's like the world's competitive enough. It's like the idea is to prepare as best as you can, get as much situational awareness of environment as possible in that scenario for you, and then trust yourself. Look at yourself from a distance. Zoom out. Reflexively, right? So you hear people use the term reflection and then reflexive. And reflexive means like the same thing as reflection, but looking at your role in it. So if I was like reflexive about how a class went or something, I'd be like reflecting on how my behavior in the class shifted things a certain way or whatever. So it's looking at your role in it. It's like there's a real benefit in that. It's shifting the focus of your attention, because those two things are obviously directly related. And because part of a lot of our day-to-day, moment-to-moment distress is like getting overwhelmed with what's right now and what feels negative right now. And you realize like you've had a million of those things in your life, and you're only worrying about 2 or 3 right now, and there'll be a different 2 or 3 tomorrow and the next day, and then you realize like, okay, well, there's this like potential to be worried that's always with me. Number 1, exercise the freedom to choose your attitude. And extend. All this is based on this idea of extending beyond yourself. It's like the biggest realization, to be honest, that I've had of what that would even mean is like having a kid. Like with Evie, it's like realizing that her experience and my experience are so intimately connected. It's like I need to, it's not just myself, like beyond yourself in the deepest meaning that could imply. So here's another concept model. This is again from Mary S. Desilek from her PhD. It's interesting that the first one was dated 14. This is dated 2013. Saying like when the noetic just briefly, like just without getting into the difference, you can almost think of like this as meaning spiritual. When the spiritual dimension is accessed, self-transcendence is possible. This is a Frankl idea. When the noetic dimension is accessed, it just says it there, it actually says spiritual in brackets, self-transcendence is possible, and that there's these like, the reason I stopped is like, this is just one of these things that there's so much pain in this model, really, that people get trapped in, all of us get trapped at times in our own forms of existential frustration. Just look at that model. Sometimes it's in the direction of loss of hope, and that's associated with things like depression and addiction and aggression, and sometimes it's in the direction of despair and guilt and unavoidable suffering and existential concerns around death, the tragic triad and the neurotic triad, right? And the difference is whether we're talking about inner pain or outer focused pain. And like, again, like at a certain point we could almost do a whole course on just this model, because it's really a compression of what logotherapy is. And notice that circle in the middle. That's fascinating work on breaking the barrier from meaningless to meaningful. And that meaning triangle of that we looked at a little bit before, of attitude and creativity and experience, and like basically just doing things that feel like they matter, and having experiences that feel like they matter, and relationships that feel like they matter, and feeling like you matter. It's like that's where your healing lies. So I want to switch now. So I just talked about Viktor Frankl's, now Carl Rogers. And a lot of you will have learned of Rogers, right? And if you've taken classes with me, you've learned about Rogers. You've heard me rant about how he was one of the biggest psychologists to kind of make this shift into what we now call counseling, or person-centered, client-centered. That language all comes from Roger, this focus on therapeutic rapport is Rogers. But an idea that's often overlooked is his kind of broader picture of the psyche, and he believed that, okay, there's the environment and the person. So this person comes into your therapeutic counseling situation and sits down, and that therapeutic situation, that counseling room, is an environment, and there's a potential for learning in that situation. But this individual is coming in with their own motivations, and that individual actually exists in a phenomenological world, meaning a lived reality. And that lived reality has lived relationships and lived experiences and behaviors and objects and images and thoughts and people. And so like this person's coming into your office with this cosmos, this universe in their head, this phenomenal world was Roger's language. And he was like, if you understand that, you can actually interact better with people. You realize like people have this highly socially evolved, sort of co-evolved with their whole social world, phenomenal world, this running story of what everything is. And that's highly tied with self. It's not self. Right? So I think that the reason I use this specific picture, I think they kind of nailed it. It's like it looks like a simple picture, but it's actually not. It actually is. You can look at it at a couple levels of depth. Notice how the self is the consuming aspect there. It's like those are subparts, right? Like the behavior objects are like they exist within this, the broader, stronger, larger self. It's actually a pretty deep idea, that because what he's going to say is then all of a sudden you start talking about things, and you're triggering things, and people are responding to you in these ways that don't really make sense from just what you said, but it's because it's going through this interpretive framework. this phenomenal field. So now just to take this idea a little bit further, it's like Roger's whole theory then, I want to just make this link to how it's kind of a reflection of this. So if there's this situation, he says, Roger's theory of therapeutic change. If these conditions exist, so somebody comes as a client to a therapeutic session, let's say I'm the therapist, they're the client, and they're experiencing some kind of vulnerability or anxiety, they contact a counselor who say, then I can be with them in that relationship. They come in and I can establish what Rogers called congruence, which basically means like I feel like I'm a real, authentic person with them, that they feel like I'm actually listening, that I actually give 2 cents about their life, that I actually care, right? And that I actually, that doesn't mean that I necessarily approve of everything they do. It doesn't mean I'm like, oh, that, yeah, you're right. It doesn't mean I'm like patting them on the back constantly at all. But it means that they're not feeling this like, because remember, a lot of people in this scenario might be coming to you maybe potentially in this therapeutic setting, and to talk about something that they maybe have never talked about, or something that they feel really ambivalent about bringing up. And then for you to be like, as soon as they say something a little bit off-putting, it's like that's gonna trigger their hypersensitivity to rejection, right? And so Rogers was saying this idea of what he called unconditional positive regard. That's kind of what I'm saying, is like that it's not the same as approving everything. And then when you can have this like congruence, when you can be real in your relationship, when you can hear people's stories and try to help them without this need to morally judge constantly, but that being able to be smart enough to understand that that doesn't mean that you're accepting anything, and that you might be calling out the person on all kinds of things. The client then perceives 3, 4, and 5. So the client feels, this is one big part of Rogers, right? It's like, not only do you have to be like this as a therapist, it has to be experienced by the client as this. And if the client feels like you're being real in the relationship, and like you have this unconditional positive regard, and like you're actually trying to empathically understand, or use an empathic understanding, which basically he meant by that is like going into the other person, the mental exercise of going into the other person's lived experience as if you were them, without losing the as if part of that sentence. If all those things can happen, then therapeutic change occurs, and the client can become more congruent, less defensive, more open to experience, have a more realistic view of the world, develop positive self-regard, narrow the gap between the ideal self and the real self, become less vulnerable to threat, less anxious, take ownership of experiences, more accepting, more congruent with their relationships with others. So this is another one of these images that's like, it really looks basic, but it actually contains a really accurate and meaningful depiction of what Rogers meant. So if you look at this idea that incongruent, so one way it gets a laugh out of people in class, usually I'll be like, imagine everybody in the class is playing a symphony and you're all doing an amazing job, you're all musicians and you're playing like all the different instruments, and I come in with the only instrument I have a banjo. I don't know how to play really. This is one of my goals for the summer, is to learn how to play. I know that's like a weird piece of information to randomly say, but my father-in-law gave me a banjo because he's a musician, has a bunch of instruments, and kind of was giving each family an instrument, and I've always thought the banjos were cool for whatever reason. Anyways, I come in, you guys are all playing perfect. I come in with my banjo and I'm just like, bing, bing, bing. I like don't even know how to play it, so I'm just like doing one string or something, and it wrecks the sound. This is the weirdest way to explain a word ever, but you'd say that I was very incongruent with the rest of you. I wasn't like balanced. And so what Rogers says is like, when people are in this feeling of being incongruent, what they want to be and how they see their life is so far apart. Now notice when he's saying congruent or balanced, it's not complete overlap. The ideal and who you're trying to be and who you feel yourself are starts to overlap, and you're still aiming at things. The self-image becomes more similar, though, to the ideal self, and there's more of an overlap, and this person then becomes in a position to potentially self-actualize. When there's too much difference between self-image and ideal self, remember self-image, how you see yourself, ideal self, how you'd like to see yourself. In those scenarios, self-actualization will be difficult. Rogers was it's like this brutal honesty idea of I used this in the previous course, his quote where he says, the curious paradox of change is that when you accept yourself as you are, then you can change. So in this course, we're going to kind of touch on all three of the big branches in early psychoanalysis, right? So there's Freud, Jung, and Adler. And Adler we haven't touched on a lot, but I'm about to show you something on him. And he is a very interesting character also in the whole history of psychology. So he believed that in the first stage of I'll just go over this quick and then I have a video to show. He believed in the first stage of the therapeutic process was about this idea of empathy and relationship, very similar to Rogers, that the therapist offers a warmth and empathy and acceptance and hope and reassurance and encouragement, trying to create a cooperative working relationship. So notice the arrow on the right, we're moving from support to encouragement. At the second stage, you get into this informational stage where the therapist is starting to, okay, so at the beginning, right? So again, let me back up. At the beginning, someone's coming to you maybe in a state of crisis. So the first question you are is not like, okay, let's detail a multi-step problem-solving approach. It's like the person's not at that stage yet. The person needs to be supported, calmed, grounded. Then maybe you move to this point of information processing, of gathering unstructured, relevant information, just talking about things, details of presenting problems and life tasks. Maybe because it's Adler and because this is psychoanalysis, very interest in early childhood experiences and memories. Stage 3 of now you've basically established empathy and relationship, got some information, now you're trying to clarify. Therapist clarifies vague thinking with Socratic questioning. So it's like, you said this, what did you mean by this? How did you feel in this situation? Socratic questioning. Socrates would teach people by, what do you think the difference between a concept of beauty and something beautiful is? And why? How can there be a bunch of things that are beautiful? What does beauty mean? And then you answer, and then I kind of pick at what you said and I ask another question, another question. Eventually you have this like articulate answer to what beauty is. And my role in that was nudging you like, okay, well, that wasn't clear. What did you mean by that? Okay, well, that makes sense. But this one part, it's like, that's actually, people explain it in really difficult ways. But if you got what my weird rant there, that's what Socratic means. And then once that's been done, encouragement. So then you're actually helping the client generate alternatives. The client's moving maybe in a new direction away from lifestyles. Remember Century of Self, that documentary? You'll put together that idea. Clarifying new feelings about efforts and results. So let's check out a video on Adler.
It would not be easy to find another author, wrote Henry Ellenberger in The Discovery of the Unconscious, from which so much has been borrowed from all sides without acknowledgement than Alfred Adler. While Alfred Adler was one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, he is greatly overshadowed by two of his contemporaries, Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. Adler's approach to understanding human behavior, however, has an appealing aspect which these two other men sometimes lack. He is extremely practical. He relied on a common-sense approach to explain why people behave as they do, and how they can best go about changing their behavior to live more flourishing lives. One of the overriding themes of his work is that often the source of our suffering is not to be found in the way life challenges us, but in the solutions we adopt in the face of such challenges. And in this video, we will provide an overview of Adler's psychology in order to flesh out this idea. According to Adler, if we are to understand why a person behaves as they do, we must first recognize that humans have a tendency to strive after self-created goals. The first thing we discover in the psychic trends is that the movements are directed toward a goal. This teleology, this striving for goals, is innate in the concept of adaptation. Each of us holds a multitude of goals with respect to different aspects of our life. Our choice of these goals, according to Adler, is structured by a higher order goal called our self-ideal. Our self-ideal represents the ideal type of person we would like to become, and its formation begins early in childhood. How can we best find our place in this world, we wonder, and the way we answer this question forms our self-ideal. Our self-ideal, in other words, shapes the course of our life in that it points to the future and pulls us toward what could be, what might be. Our self-ideal plays a crucial role in our development in that it influences our striving for superiority, which according to Adler is the fundamental drive behind human behavior. We are, in other words, naturally driven to improve our perceived lot in life, to gain a more advantageous position, or as Adler put it, the material of life has been constantly bent on reaching a plus from a minus situation. While the striving for superiority is innate, the specific manifestations of this striving are determined by the content of our self-ideal. We strive for superiority, in other words, by seeking to actualize our self-ideal. As we go through life, we learn what type of behaviors and thought patterns move us closer to our self-ideal and which hinder us. In the process, we develop what Adler called our lifestyle, which is the subjective, unarticulated set of guidelines individuals develop and use to move them through life and toward their goals. Adler was insistent that we cannot, in an a priori manner, judge a lifestyle as healthy or unhealthy, normal or abnormal. Rather, we can only observe it in action and see what success it brings. For Adler, there was no normal lifestyle. Every lifestyle was adequate until life presented it with a task for which it was not prepared. It was at those times that its weak points emerged. The weak points of our lifestyle frustrate us in our pursuit of superiority and trigger feelings of inferiority. Feelings of inferiority are based on the subjective evaluations we make of ourselves or the conclusions we draw with respect to our ability to reach our goals. Inferiority feelings are often triggered by what are called objective inferiorities, which are inferiorities that are based on some measurable criteria in comparison to another. For example, we may be objectively inferior in terms of our strength or height, the amount of money we earn, or our skill at a certain activity. An objective inferiority, however, only triggers feelings of inferiority if it is somehow important to our striving after superiority. If, for example, someone is poor, but money is not an important part of their self-ideal, their lack of wealth will not trigger inferiority feelings. On the other hand, feelings of inferiority can arise in the absence of objective inferiorities. Very often people perceive themselves to be inferior in ways which have no basis in reality. How we react and adapt to our inferiorities strongly impacts our psychological health and the overall quality of our life. Adler suggested there are two primary ways people deal with feelings of inferiority. Either we see the circumstances which produce them as challenges to be confronted and so make use of coping behaviors, or we view them as problems to be avoided and resort to safeguarding behaviors. Coping behaviors can be divided into two types: direct problem solving and compensation. When we believe we can directly address the cause of our inferiority feelings, we adopt a problem-solving approach. If we lose a job, we look for another one. If our skills are inadequate in a certain endeavor, we spend time improving them. If, on the other hand, direct problem-solving is impossible, we may resort to the coping behavior called compensation. We look for ways to make up for our inferiority by excelling in a manner which can compensate for our deficit. For example, someone who loses their hearing may compensate by cultivating the ability to read lips. Many people, however, are unwilling to address their issues in this manner and so turn to safeguarding behaviors. Safeguarding behaviors are used in the attempt to convince oneself and others that the reason they have failed to address their inferiorities and moved closer to their goals is because certain obstacles, which they claim lie outside of their control, are impeding their progress. Adler likened safeguarding behaviors to the sideshows seen at a circus, as they are used to distract attention away from the most pressing issues of one's life, and to direct it instead to issues which are relatively trivial. Safeguarding behaviors take a variety of forms. Some people develop physical issues such as headaches or chronic tiredness, which are then used as excuses for why they cannot face up to their challenges. Others develop anxiety disorders which are used in a similar manner. They use their fears as a justification for why they cannot take the actions needed to move them closer to their goals. At other times, instead of relying on excuses and symptoms, people turn to the safeguarding behavior that Adler called distance seeking. This entails procrastination, or only taking the tiniest of steps forward before falling back into one's comfort zone. While we all make use of safeguarding behaviors to one degree or another, problems arise when the use of them goes on for too long. For as Ellenberger noted in The Discovery of the Unconscious, Adler saw those who rely on safeguarding behaviors as pitiful individuals who made use of transparent tricks in order to escape life's duties. Safeguarding behaviors eventually lose their effectiveness. We can only rely on certain excuses for so long before others see through them. When this happens, we have two options. We can begin to address our issues head-on, or we can completely withdraw from the challenge, thus developing what Adler called an inferiority complex. To avoid this fate, we must cease relying on safeguarding behaviors and learn to directly face up to our challenges. Adler believed that sometimes the reason people struggle to do this is because they have adopted a self-ideal which is unconducive to a healthy existence. Perhaps our self-ideal is overly perfectionist or too reliant on the pursuit of such things as wealth, status, power, fame, or beauty. In other words, our self-ideal is so unrealistic that we are forever thwarted in our attempts to achieve our goals, and so we resort to safeguarding behaviors not knowing what else to do. Therefore, becoming more aware of what we are striving for and adjusting our self-ideal, if necessary, is a crucial step towards self-improvement. In the end, however, even with a more realistic self-ideal, we will only change if we learn to be more courageous. Adler believed that the most basic concern of psychotherapy should simply be to help people cultivate a more courageous attitude toward life. Courage, wrote Adler, is not an ability one either possesses or lacks. Courage is the willingness to engage in a risk-taking behavior regardless of whether the consequences are unknown or possibly adverse. We are capable of courageous behavior provided we are willing to engage in it. Given that we cannot expect life to cease challenging us, we have a choice. Either we cultivate a courageous attitude and learn to coexist with the uncertainty and discomfort this will invite into our life, or we doom ourselves to waste away our days, receding further and further into the misery of our comfort zone.
The first question we're likely to encounter in a new meeting with somebody is, what do you do? And according to how you answer that question, you'll either be, praised and become a subject of interest, or you'll be left alone by the peanuts. And this suggests to me that we live in a world of snobs. And a snob is really anyone who takes a small part of you and uses that to come to a universal and rigid sense of who you are and how much you matter. And the kind of snobbery that is dominant in the world today is not around bloodlines or lineage or your closeness to the Queen of England as it used to be, but what job you have, and in particular how impressive your powers of financial accumulation are. And according to that criteria, people will judge you immediately. So it's sometimes said that we live in a materialistic world. I don't think we do live in a materialistic world. We simply live in a world where material accumulation has become the gateway to the respect and love that we all crave. It's not really the riches and the fast cars, etc., that we crave. It's the honor and love, if you like, that they are a conduit to, that they are perhaps the only conduit to. And that's a different way of looking at so-called greed. The next time you walk down the road and you see somebody driving a Ferrari, don't think this is somebody who's greedy, who's materialistic. Think first and foremost, this is somebody with an incredibly intense need for love, who has not been able to find the honor and respect they need in normal ways, and therefore they're needing so much more stuff in order to feel they have the right to exist. If you can deal with just riding a bike through town, and that's okay, something's gone right in your past. If you're a parent and your child has no ambition to become famous, you're doing something right, because that means that that person is able to deal with being them without too much other stuff. Look, I think one of the most beautiful but also dangerous ideas, it's an American idea, is the notion that anyone can achieve anything, right? And we hear these messages from everywhere. That is the spirit of our times. It's a beautiful message, but it's a dangerous message. Because if you really believe in a world where you can do anything, and you've only done a bit, you've only done something, my goodness, how crushed you will feel. The possibilities for humiliation are so much greater now. If you go to an American bookshop and you look at the self-help section, there are basically two kinds of books on that shelf. The first kind is books telling you how to make $1 million in an afternoon. And the other books are books telling you how to cope with what they call low self-esteem. And the two are totally related. If you live in a culture that's telling you how to make $1 million in an afternoon, you're going to have a massive self-esteem problem. Because how can you achieve esteem of yourself when you're going to be part of the 99%, not the 1%? Most of us are going to have an ordinary life. So what have we done building a world in which an ordinary life is not good enough? This is crazy. This is a form of self-torture. We've now created a life where an ordinary life is materially more comfortable than it's ever been. An ordinary life, you're going to get a good car, you're going to be able to have a bath every night, you're going to have a roof over your head, you're going to have pretty nourishing food, right? So materially, an ordinary life is terrific. But then we've put a snake in the grass. We've ruined paradise that we've built and our ancestors have built for ourselves by telling ourselves that actually, contrary to everything we hoped for, actually an ordinary life is psychologically not good enough. It's not good enough just to drive an ordinary car and have an ordinary house and have an ordinary bath once a day and have an ordinary meal. No, that's not good enough. You need to be extraordinary. Become Mark Zuckerberg. Become somebody else, right? This is a kind of torture that we've imposed on ourselves. We're insane. How have we made a life where the statistical odds of you leading that life, the 99% surety that you will lead that life, has come to seem like a humiliation and the wrong sort of life? This is setting yourself up for disaster. The Danish are clever. The Danes have built a society for themselves. I was in Denmark recently. They've built a society for losers, right? They have understood, unlike the Americans or the Brits, that most of us are going to be losers. So they've made sure that schools for losers are going to be fantastic, and trains for losers are going to be beautiful, and kindergartens for losers. I'm using the word loser with irony. I'm using the word loser to define that actually all of us, the 99%, are going to be. We are, all of us, almost fated. And in every area of life, we will encounter failure. We're fated to be ordinary. And an ordinary life is a good life. And let's not torture ourselves that the only way to be good enough is to be extraordinary. This is poison. And look, don't get me wrong, a bit of ambition is fantastic. A bit of get up and go is fantastic. We're not in any danger of being unambitious. The danger now is suicide. I'm putting it at its starkest. The danger is that we will feel so inadequate in relation to the expectations placed upon us that we may choose to end our own lives. And this happens in huge numbers. We are suffering from an epidemic of mental unwellness, largely bred by the expectation that our lives will be stellar, when in fact they are far more likely only to be ordinary. Our lack of acceptance of ourselves has made us sick. Meritocracy is based on the idea that people will get what they deserve. If you really believe in a world in which those who get to the top deserve to get to the top, you're going to be believing in a world in which those who are at the bottom deserve to be there. So being poor and so-called unsuccessful moves from being a problem to being a condemnation of your society on you. You move from being an unfortunate to being a loser, and it's incredibly punitive. So no wonder people take that very badly, and they do.
So we don't need any more reminders from General Patton or anyone else to get up and go and be a winner. We know that that's in our DNA now as modern human beings. We've had that message and it's making us sick. We know it so well, we know it too well. And we need to hear another message. And that message is, you're okay. It's okay. It's okay to fail. It's okay to be ordinary. It's okay not to know what's going on. It's okay to be lost in a universe, most of whose recesses will always be darkness to us. That's all of it okay. And joy is not going to be making $10 million. Joy is going to be a drink with a friend. Joy is going to be a meal that turns out okay. Joy is going to be a day at the end of which no one's died, there's been no crisis, it's been more or less all right. Love is not going to be perfection. Love is going to be occasionally a hand held by somebody who understands bits of you, never the whole of you, but has charity towards your darkest moments. You know, that is the life we're going to lead, and let that be okay.
Another really interesting psychologist. The word courage comes from the same stem as the French word cœur, meaning heart. Just as one's heart, by pumping blood into one's arms, legs, and brain, enables all other physical organs to function, so courage makes possible all the psychological virtues. Without courage, other values wither away into mere facsimils of virtue, fake virtue.
The world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. Nowadays we are not threatened by elementary catastrophes. There is no such thing as an H-bomb. That is all man's doing. We are the great danger. The psyche is the great danger. What if something goes wrong with the psyche? See? And so you see, it is demonstrated to us in our days what the power of the psyche is of man, how important it is to know something about it, but we know nothing about it. Nobody would give credit to the idea that the psychical processes of the ordinary man have any importance whatever. One thinks, oh, he has just what he has in his head. It is all from his surroundings. He's taught such a thing, believes such a thing. And particularly if he's well housed and well fed, then he has no ideas at all. And that's the great mistake. Because he is just that as which he is born, and he is not born as tabula rasa, but as a reality.
Yes.
Jung had a vision at the end of his life of a catastrophe. It was a world catastrophe.
I don't want to speak much about it. One of his daughters took notes and after his death gave it. And there's a drawing with a line going down, up and down, and underneath is the last 50 years of humanity. And some remarks about a final catastrophe being ahead. But I have only those notes.
Mm-hmm. What is your own feeling about it, the world
situation?
Well,
one's whole feeling revolts against this idea. But since I have those notes in a drawer, I don't allow myself to be too optimistic. I think, well, we have always had wars and enormous catastrophes, and I have no more personal fear much about that. I mean, at my age, if you have anyhow soon to go, so or so, egocentrically spoken. But the beauty of all the life, to think that the billions and billions and billions of years of evolution to build up the plants and the animals and the whole beauty of nature, and that man would go out of sheer shadow foolishness and destroy it all. I mean, that our life might go from the planet. And we don't know. On Mars and Venus, there's no life. We don't know if there's any life experiment elsewhere in the galaxies. And we go and destroy this. I think it's so abominable. I try to pray that it may not happen, that a miracle happens.
Do you find that young people that you see now are aware of that it's in their consciousness?
Yes, it's partly in consciousness, partly in their consciousness, and I think in a very dangerous way, namely in a way of giving up and running away into a fantasy world. You know, when you study science fiction, you see there's always the fantasy of escaping to some other planet and begin anew again, which means give up the battle on this earth. Look, consider it hopeless and give up. I think one shouldn't give up. Because if you think of answer to Job, if man would wrestle with God, if man would tell God that he shouldn't do it, if we would reflect more, that's why reflection comes in. Jung never thought that we might do better than just possibly sneak around the corner with not too big a catastrophe. When I saw him last, he had also a vision while I was with him, but there he said, I see enormous stretches devastated, enormous stretches of the earth. But thank God it's not the whole planet. I think that if not more people try to reflect and take back their projections and take the opposites within themselves, there will be a total destruction.
Just want to take a quick second to thank you, NIPSing students. You're quite awesome, and I really hope you enjoyed this presentation. Out of your vulnerabilities will come your strengths. The great doctor himself. Cheers, take care of your loved ones and take care of yourself. See you in the next video.